Welcome to Still Unanswered. I'm Rachel Cortez. Today, we return to a case that has haunted southeastern Virginia for decades, the Colonial Parkway murders. This is one of those stories that feels like it belongs in the margins of history, a scenic, historic road by day, and at night, especially in the late 1980s, an eerie stretch of dark overlooks and marshes where a predator picked off young couples. It's been called one of America's eeriest unsolved serial cases. Until recently, much of it stayed stubbornly, painfully unresolved. But in the last couple of years, 2024 through 2026, new DNA work and FBI announcements have finally tied a deceased waterman, Alan Wade Wilmer Sr., to multiple victims, including the first known Parkway couple. Still, as we'll explore today, a lot remains unanswered.
Thanks, Rachel. It's good to be here. The case it's really layered. There's the geography, the jurisdictional puzzle, the forensics timeline, the trauma to communities, and then you add modern DNA breakthroughs, and suddenly old files get a new light. But it doesn't magically make every question disappear. Not at all.
Right. So let's start at the beginning, sort of. Marcus, tell listeners, what and where is the Colonial Parkway? Paint the scene for us.
The Colonial Parkway is a 22-mile scenic roadway that links Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Yorktown, the heart of the Colonial National Historical Park. By day, it's marketed as this idyllic loop of America's early history, colonial sites, oak trees, gently curving lanes. But by night, especially in the 1980s, it was largely unlit, with long stretches of darkness, pull-offs, scenic overlooks. There were very few houses right next to the road. So for young couples looking for privacy, it became a classic lover's lane. You could sit out there in near total darkness, with only the trees and the river outlines. Perfect for privacy. Also perfect for someone looking to prey on that privacy.
I grew up in coastal Virginia. I remember those spots. The water just beyond the shoulder of the road, the smell of salt and marsh, the hush at night. You could be a tourist one evening and it felt safe. But then people started disappearing from exactly those quiet spots. It rattled my hometown in a way you couldn't really explain.
Yeah, and it's important to highlight that not every attack in this string happened literally on the parkway itself. The crimes are better understood as clustered in an arc of remote, waterside places within about an hour's drive of each other. So the parkway is the most famous thread in that pattern, but it's not the only thread.
That's a good point. So the setting itself, the landscape and the tidewater context, plays a role in both why victims were targeted and why the case became so hard to solve. Marcus, expand on that.
Sure. The geography of tidewater rivers, creeks, marshes, causeways created both opportunities and challenges. For an offender, it means lots of routes for quick movement and lots of places where evidence could be lost to water. For investigators, it means crimes that cross municipal lines, sometimes, state or federal land, and often involve different agencies with distinct record-keeping systems. On top of that, the region has a heavy military presence, Navy bases, shipyards, so people come and go. That transient element complicates everything: eyewitness accounts, alibis, suspect movement patterns.
So we have this scenic 22-mile road that's unlit, remote at night, and sits inside a web of waterways and jurisdictions. Combine that with couples going out to be alone, and it becomes, as you said, an ideal hunting ground. I want to get into the timeline soon, but before we do, can you explain for listeners how the Colonial Parkway being managed by the National Park Service mattered? It isn't a state road, right?
Exactly. The Colonial Parkway is managed by the National Park Service, not a state or local government. That matters because the NPS has a different legal and administrative footprint. When you have violent crimes that touch federal land, local police may defer or coordinate in different ways than they would on state roads. Investigative authority and record-keeping can get tangled. Who has jurisdiction? Who leads? Who holds the files? Those early decisions, sometimes administrative and bureaucratic, can ripple down decades later when investigators want to revisit evidence, compare cases, or consolidate reports.
So, just to be clear, that patchwork of authority could delay the way cases were investigated and the way information was shared, which, in a serial pattern, is crucial.
Absolutely. Serial offenders operate across boundaries, and so must investigations. If those boundaries slow or prevent investigators from connecting dots, it becomes much easier for a pattern to remain invisible. That's part of why the Colonial Parkway cases, this string of attacks on young couples, slid into that darker, unresolved space for so long.
It's infuriating, you know? The human cost, the families. I want to bring up something that's both hopeful and also complicated: the recent DNA developments. The FBI and other agencies announced between 2024 and 2026 that DNA tied a deceased waterman named Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. to multiple victims, including the first known Parkway couple. Marcus, how significant is that?
It's significant in the sense that DNA finally placed a suspect, deceased now, into that narrative, and specifically tied him to the first known victims. From a closure perspective, that matters. Families want to know who did it. But the announcement also raises more questions than it answers. Were there other victims beyond those DNA linked? Was Wilmer acting alone? Did he have help? Why did it take decades for this connection to emerge? Those are questions that DNA alone doesn't answer.
Right. So when you say DNA didn't answer everything, what are the kinds of limits investigators face, even with modern forensic tools?
Several. First, DNA can tie a person to physical evidence, say fibers, touch DNA, semen, if that evidence was collected and preserved, and if the sample was viable. But a lot depends on what was collected at the time. In the late 1980s, collection methods and awareness were different. Some evidence may have been degraded, contaminated, or never taken. Second, DNA can identify a person, but not necessarily their role. Were they the perpetrator, an acquaintance, a passerby? Context matters. Third, if the suspect is deceased, like Wilmer, DNA gives attribution, but it limits the ability to interview, to understand motive, to flush out co-conspirators. Finally, just because one suspect is linked doesn't mean the entire string is explained. Serial patterns sometimes involve copycats, sometimes separate offenders exploiting the same opportunity.
That makes sense. So even though DNA has finally connected Wilmer to some victims, the broader mosaic, who else, whether other incidents are related, remains uncertain. Talk to me, Marcus. What about the behavioral angle? Based on what you know of the geography and the pattern, can you sketch, carefully, cautiously, what kind of offender we might be looking at?
Carefully and cautiously, yes. The pattern of targeting young couples in isolated, romantic spots points to an offender who selects vulnerability and privacy, someone who knew the landscape and the times couples would use it. Knowledge of waterways and multiple dump sites suggests familiarity with the region, possibly occupational ties that involved being on or near the water, which is why the identification of a waterman as a suspect aligns with that hypothesis. It also suggests comfort moving across county lines and ease with disposal in water or marsh. But I want to emphasize, profiling gives probabilities, not certainties. It helps prioritize leads, not declare a final answer.
Yeah, I appreciate that caveat. We have the human tendency to want a neat narrative, an identifiable villain, a moment of revelation. But with cases like this, the reality is messy. Interrupting for a second here, Marcus, did the presence of military bases and shipyards in the region affect how investigators considered suspects? Like more transient populations, you said.
Exactly. Large military and shipyard communities mean a high number of people moving in and out, temporary residences, long deployments, rotations. That can make it harder to track whereabouts at specific times. Also, transient populations can create a larger pool of possible suspects and more complicated alibis. On the other hand, military records and employment details can sometimes be useful if an investigator has access to them and the timeline. Again, it's a logistical and interagency coordination issue.
Right. Coordination. It keeps coming back to coordination. Let's step back and talk about the victims without naming names, because I want listeners to understand who was targeted. What patterns emerged in victim selection?
The consistent pattern was young couples, often parked in quiet, out-of-the-way places. They were together, usually alone, looking for privacy. That's a very specific target profile. People who are relaxed, less vigilant, and in an environment where help would be far away. The offender, again based on these patterns, selected those moments of lowered guard. There's a predatory logic to it.
And, that's what makes it so visceral, right? These are ordinary moments. Teenagers, college-age couples, doing something very human, and someone turned it into an opportunity to destroy lives. I struggle with how to say that without sounding dramatic. Marcus, were there investigative mistakes early on that later hampered the ability to connect the cases?
There were certainly systemic issues rather than single mistakes. For example, differences in who held jurisdiction, federal versus local, led to fractured records. In some cases, evidence retention standards in the 1980s weren't what they are now, so what was preserved was uneven. Also, the linkage between cases relies on pattern recognition. If one agency doesn't share details that seem minor at the time, the pattern can stay fragmented. That said, it's also true that investigators did pursue leads vigorously at times. Again, this is complex. It's not a simple story of negligence. It's a story of an era, technology, and jurisdictional complexity.
That nuance is important. Let's talk a little more about the forensics timeline. You mentioned modern DNA tools. How did advancements over the last few decades create the possibility of connecting Wilmer to the Parkway victims now?
Advances in DNA testing have been dramatic. Techniques like touch DNA analysis, improved extraction methods, and expanded databases have changed what's possible. Where an older lab might have concluded a sample was too degraded or insufficient, modern labs can sometimes recover usable profiles from tiny amounts of genetic material. Then there's the rise of investigative genetic genealogy, using distant matches in public or law enforcement accessible databases to build family trees that lead to an identity. These tools didn't exist or weren't available for decades, so cold cases that once sat dormant can now be revisited. That's the context in which recently the FBI and partners were able to link Alan Wade Wilmer Sr., a deceased waterman, to multiple victims.
Yeah, and again, important to say, the identification of a deceased suspect answers a crucial question for some families, but it raises others. Marcus, as someone who used to do behavioral analysis for the FBI, what's your take on public reaction to these DNA breakthroughs? People often expect immediate closure, but like you said, DNA can identify, not explain.
Public expectations are often shaped by media narratives. TV shows where genealogy leads to a suspect, a confession follows, case closed in an hour. Real life is slower and messier. DNA identification helps narrow a case dramatically. It can prompt re-interviews, new searches, and, when suspects are alive, charges. It can also provide emotional closure. But if the suspect is dead, it removes some options investigators would otherwise have, like getting a confession or understanding motive. Also, identifying a suspect doesn't always fill gaps about the totality of crimes, possible accomplices, or undiscovered victims. For families, there's relief in naming a person. For investigators, there's still work to do.
And for communities, especially small, interlinked ones like parts of Tidewater, these kinds of revelations can reopen wounds. But they can also push cold files back onto desks, you know? I want to let listeners hear both of our voices. So I'll ask you a question, Marcus, and then I'll add something from my perspective. Do you think there were more victims than those DNA linked? And if you don't know, how do investigators go about testing that hypothesis?
Short answer, it's possible. Long answer, investigators look for pattern clustering, time frames, geographic proximity, victimology. They re-examine unidentified remains, unsolved homicides, missing persons reports in overlapping time periods. They also rerun old evidence through modern labs and compare DNA profiles across cases. But again, if evidence wasn't collected or preserved, some cases may never link. So the hypothesis is testable to a degree, but it's bounded by the historical record.
Right. And from my experience reporting in this region, families sometimes told their stories in inconsistent ways early on, understandably, out of grief, fear, or confusion. So connecting older reports requires a lot of careful cross-referencing. Okay, interrupting again. Marcus, this might be a blunt question. Could there have been accomplices?
Potentially. Certain patterns can suggest an accomplice. Multiple people needed to control victims, for example, or evidence of different tasks being performed. But there's no simple checklist. Investigators look for corroborating testimony, linked communications, physical evidence that implicates others. The presence of multiple dump sites and knowledge of waterways might suggest the possibility of help, but it could also reflect a single offender with deep local knowledge. DNA that identifies more than one person tied to the same scene would be the clearest physical indicator of multiple participants.
That's careful wording, Marcus. I appreciate it. We have to be precise with speculation. Let's take a step to humanize this. As a journalist, I think it's important not to reduce everything to patterns and forensics. Families, victims are still at the center. From what I know, the recent announcements have had profound emotional impacts. Some families got answers, others still wait. Marcus, how should investigators and communities balance the need for ongoing inquiry with sensitivity to families who've carried this for decades?
Balance is the operative word. Investigators should keep families informed and engaged. Transparency matters. Even when answers are partial, sharing the state of an investigation can help families process. Communities should also allow families space to grieve and to speak when they are ready. Cold case units often try to integrate victim-centered approaches precisely because reopening a case can re-traumatize. So it's a delicate dance. Pursue the truth, but do it in a way that honors the people who were harmed.
Yeah, and I would add, media has a responsibility too. We like to chase the sensational edges of these stories, but there's a line between public interest and exploitation. Okay, let's talk about public myths and legends. The Colonial Parkway case has accumulated a kind of local folklore. How does folklore affect investigations and public perception?
Folklore can obscure facts. When you have an atmosphere of fear and rumor stories about the Parkway killer or certain lurid details, it can lead to false leads, witnesses misremembering events, and polarization between law enforcement and communities. But folklore also reflects community trauma. It's a cultural artifact of how people process fear. Investigators need to separate rumor from reliable evidence while respecting that folklore signals real collective anxiety.
Yeah, that tension between rumor and evidence plays out over decades. I want to return to the identification of Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. We need to be precise. The FBI and partners announced in the period 2024-2026 that DNA tied him to multiple victims, including the first known Parkway couple. We can talk about the implications without overclaiming. Marcus, in your view, what are the next investigative steps once a deceased suspect is identified via DNA?
Once a suspect is identified, even if deceased, investigative steps often include re-examining evidence from all linked cases, re-interviewing witnesses and associates, checking travel and employment records to establish where the suspect was at relevant times, and looking for physical evidence in other unsolved cases that could match. If the suspect had family or close associates, investigators might seek additional DNA samples to confirm familial links in genealogical leads. They also try to determine whether other unsolved cases fit the suspect's known timeline and locations. So the work accelerates, but it doesn't end.
I want to add a small, personal note. When these cases come back into the public eye, neighbors sometimes remember small details, conversations, sightings, that suddenly become relevant. It's why public appeals matter, even now. Marcus, do you think modern interagency coordination is better positioned to handle something like this now than it was in the 1980s?
In many ways, yes. Forensic technologies have improved. Investigative units dedicated to cold cases are more common. Databases allow for better information sharing, and there's more awareness of the need for coordination. But bureaucratic challenges remain: funding, resources, competing priorities. The difference is that when a new lead emerges now, like a DNA match, agencies have more tools to capitalize on it. That said, it still requires leadership and commitment to see it through.
All right. All right. I want to slow down and take a listener question. Well, a question I imagine listeners are asking. It's, why did this go unsolved for so long? You touched on parts of it, Marcus, but can you summarize the main reasons in a way that a listener can really grasp?
There's no single reason. Think of it as a confluence. 1. The landscape and geography, remote roads, waterways, multiple jurisdictions, made it easy for an offender to move and for evidence to be dispersed. 2. Administrative complexity. the Colonial Parkway being federal land, created early jurisdictional fragmentation. 3. Limitations of forensic science at the time meant evidence that might be fruitful now was either degraded or unanalyzed. 4. Transient populations complicated suspect identification. 5. Inconsistent information sharing among agencies created a fragmented record. Put them together, and you get decades of a case that's very hard to close.
Yeah, that helps listeners connect the dots without implying incompetence. It's more a story of structural challenges. Let's pause for a moment. Marcus, I want to ask a more human question. When a suspect is identified posthumously, what can families realistically expect? Closure, validation, or something else?
All of the above, in varying degrees. Some families feel a profound sense of relief. Finally a name, finally a target. Others feel anger that prosecution isn't possible. They want more. Many experience a complicated mix, some closure, but also renewed questions. Closure is rarely absolute. Validation, having investigators affirm that a long-held belief about who was responsible, can be powerful. The emotional outcome depends on the family and on how transparent investigators are during the process.
I hear that. Okay, let's move toward the broader implications. How does this case, and cases like it, change how we think about cold case investigations nationally? Marcus?
It underscores the importance of evidence preservation, cross-jurisdictional cooperation, and investing in cold case resources. It also highlights that technological advances can rewrite investigative possibilities, so keeping open lines between cold case units and modern forensic labs matters. Cases like this push agencies to rethink how they catalog and store evidence, and how they maintain institutional memory across administrations and leadership changes.
Institutional memory? That's bureaucraties for not letting files get lost in someone's closet for 30 years. But seriously, there's also a cultural lesson. The public must understand that solving cold cases takes time and resources. It's not instantaneous.
Right, and the public response matters. Pressure can be useful when it prioritizes resources, but it can also be harmful when it demands speed over rigor. These investigations require meticulous work.
So, where do we go next? For listeners who want to understand or help, what's constructive?
Stay informed. Support victim-centered journalism and advocacy groups. And if you have information, even seemingly small details, contact authorities. Also, support policies that fund cold case units and evidence preservation. And when the media covers these cases, consume with an awareness of the human cost.
By the way, if you're a local in Tidewater and you think you might have seen something decades ago, please reach out. Even small, seemingly irrelevant memories can be the piece that fits. Okay, let's bring this home. We've talked about a specific suspect, Wilmer, DNA revelations, and the many things still unknown. Marcus, final thoughts. What should listeners hold in their minds as they think about the Colonial Parkway murders tonight?
Hold two things. 1. The power of modern forensics to illuminate the past. DNA linked a man to the first known Parkway victims, and that matters. 2. The limits of that science. Identification is not the same as full explanation. There are still victims unaccounted for, questions about scope and potential accomplices, and a long trail of administrative complexity that muted early detection of the pattern. Keep both the hope and the humility.
Yeah, I'll add, remember the people at the center, the victims and their families. Names can be terrifyingly abstract in a broadcast, but each of these cases is a life interrupted, A family changed forever. These announcements are not just for headline fodder. They are attempts, painstaking and imperfect, to reckon with those losses. Before we go, quick personal note from me as someone who grew up there. When you drive the Parkway now, on a sunny day, it feels very different than the version that frightened so many in the late 80s. But those nighttime stories remain part of the landscape, and we owe it to the people affected to keep asking questions.
Agreed. And to anyone listening who has new information, those leads matter even decades later. Thanks, Rachel, for having me.
Thanks for being here, Marcus. And thanks to you, listener, for sticking with a difficult story. We'll keep watching this one as it develops. If you want to learn more, or if you have a tip related to this case, check the episode notes for contact information for the investigating agencies. Until next time, I'm Rachel Cortez. Drive safe and look out for each other.
Take care. Yeah.